So let's talk about variables. If you're new to programming in general, you might not really know what a variable is. If you already are programming in another language, you're probably familiar with this term, but it doesn't hurt to go over this concept again anyway. Basically, a variable is just like a variable in a math equation. It's the same thing. If you're familiar with algebra, then you already know essentially what a variable is. And you can see here I've got an example of 1 plus 3 equals 4. There's no variable in there. But if we said 1 plus x, then it's going to be equal to something unknown. It depends on what x is. Same thing in a programming language. And if you think about it, really if we didn't have variables in a programming language, some way to vary the input or what was stored, programs wouldn't be interactive because they would perform the same thing every time. There would be no interaction from the user. So really when you think about it, a variable, the concept of a variable is allowing us to have something be changing in our program, and that is really what makes a program interactive. That's at the higher level. Now at the low level, what is a variable? What does a variable do in our code? It is basically a way that we can store some data in our program. So we can store a number in a variable, we can store a word in a variable. We have a whole bunch of things that we can store inside of variables in Java. And when we get into classes and objects later, you'll see that those are also going to be stored in a variable because they can change. And that's kind of the key to a variable, is it's a way of naming something that can change. And really, the best way to understand it is just to think about it as in terms of algebra. It's the same type of thing. And we'll go into an example of using variables in a little. Now let's talk about type. So a type is basically, it represents what that variable is going to hold or what kind of variable it is. A variable can be of many different kinds. Of all of the types or objects that exist inside of Java, each one of those could be stored in a variable, but because Java is strongly typed, we have to declare what that type is. The compiler doesn't automatically know. You probably already have somewhat of a concept of types. If you're programming in another language, for sure you would know what a type is, but if you haven't, you still probably have some concept of types. If you think about it, if I said what type is 3? Well, you might say, well, what is 3? It's a number. In Java, it would be called an int or an integer. You can already classify a number, the number 3, as a number. And if I said to you, what type is hello? You might say, well, it's a word. And in Java, it would be a string. So we're already identifying things naturally in the world by their types. If you see a chair, you recognize that and you say, it's a chair. It's a type of a chair. There is more than one chair in existence, but we classify things by type naturally. So that's all that a type is doing. And when you look at that example, when we declared a variable, we said, hey, we want a variable of type integer. That means it can hold a number, and we're going to give it a name. So that's all that a type is. And we'll get a little bit more into the different kinds of types a little bit later in this module. But the important thing to know about types in Java is that Java is strongly typed. And what that means is that once you declare a type for a variable, that variable is always of that type. If we say integer I, that variable I, named I, is always going to be of type integer. And we also have to declare the type. We can't just say, give me a variable. We can't just say, just declare a variable of I, and I'm not going to tell you the type. Instead, we have to say what the type is. So let's take a look at how we can use variables in our code. I've got our Hello World program open here, and I'm going to demonstrate creating a variable, and then we're going to look at the value of that variable. So I'll go ahead and create a variable, an integer, and we'll call this variable number, and we'll give it a value of 3. And then let's go ahead and print out, using println, just like we had done with Hello World, the value of that variable. And println is actually a method that lets us write to the console. We can call it like this with system.out.println, and it'll take a lot of the different primitive types or string and let you print to the screen. So we can print our number out, and it's going to print out 3. You can see here it says hello world, and then we have 3. And the way that this works is you can see that we have our variable, we've declared the type as an integer, we've said what the name is, and then we've done an assignment and we've assigned it to the literal value of 3. We could also do this with a string. We could say string name equals Joe, and then we could print that out as well. So let's run this and see what happens. Now you can see we've got our hello world, we've got 3, we've got Joe. So that's really the use of a variable. We could also rename or reassign a variable. So I could change the name to Jimmy, and then you can see that it was first set to Joe, then it changed to Jimmy, and now it should print out Jimmy. We can also do things like assign a variable to a equation, basically, or a statement here. We can say number equals 5 plus 2, and of course we're going to get it assigned to 7 here, and we can prove that by running, and you can see that it's now 7. So really this variable can hold the result of a computation, a string, whatever type. Now, one thing that's really important about variables that I wanted to cover here is the naming of variables. I think one of the critical things in creating readable code, and really the way that other people judge your code, I know especially when I'm interviewing someone, if I'm going to judge how well they write code, is how well they name their methods and their variables. So naming a variable correctly is very important. You should really err on the side of making your variable name too long or too descriptive rather than non-descriptive. So, for example, a bad variable name is going to be something like x or I or y. I is sometimes used in a counter, but for the most part, you want to name the variable after what it's going to hold. So in this case, when we had name here, even this is probably not as good as a name like, or a variable name like first name, because that's really what we want to hold. So this is more specific, so it's better. So really don't be afraid of how long your variable name is. It's more important to be descriptive and to clearly identify what the variable is for rather than